Keanu Reeves had always found a certain comfort in walking alone, especially after a long day on set. The evening air in New York was crisp, hinting at the arrival of autumn, and the streets buzzed with the familiar sounds of city life. People hurried past one another, lost in their routines, while the glow of streetlights reflected off rain-slicked sidewalks. Keanu pulled his coat tighter around him, appreciating the rare moment of solitude in a city that never truly slept. He decided to take a less crowded route back to his hotel, his steps steady, blending into the crowd like any other passerby. For someone of his fame, Keanu had a remarkable ability to disappear into the background when he wanted to. He didn't crave attention or the spotlight outside of his work. Tonight, he was just another man enjoying the rhythm of the city. As he approached a quiet street corner near an old diner, something caught his eye. A man, hunched over and unsteady on his feet, was stumbling along the sidewalk. His clothes were worn, his face pale and drawn, as if life itself had been slowly draining from him. For a moment, Keanu thought the man might just be intoxicated or exhausted, but then the stranger suddenly collapsed, his body crumpling onto the cold pavement without a sound. For a brief second, Keanu froze, waiting to see if anyone else would step in. People nearby slowed down, glanced over, but then quickly averted their eyes and moved along. It was a scene all too common in big cities, where the hustle and bustle often overshadowed human compassion. But Keanu couldn't just walk away. Something deep inside him stirred, an instinctive pull that he couldn't ignore. Without hesitation, he rushed over to the man, dropping to his knees beside him. The man's skin was cold to the touch, his breathing shallow and labored. Keanu gently shook his shoulder, trying to rouse him. "Hey, can you hear me?" Keanu's voice was calm but urgent, his heart beginning to pound in his chest. There was no response, just the faint rise and fall of the man's chest. Keanu quickly pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services with one hand while checking the man's pulse with the other. It was weak, barely there, but still present. As he relayed the situation to the dispatcher, his eyes scanned the man's frail figure, looking for any signs of injury or clues as to what had caused him to collapse. That's when he noticed a small, battered notebook lying a few inches from the man's hand, as if it had fallen from his pocket during the collapse. After hanging up with the dispatcher, Keanu picked up the notebook, flipping it open with care. The pages were filled with messy, almost frantic handwriting, detailing thoughts and memories that seemed to spill out of a troubled mind. One line, scrawled repeatedly across several pages, made Keanu's chest tighten. "I don't want to be a burden anymore." Keanu's throat tightened as he read those words over and over. This wasn't just a medical emergency. It was something deeper, something darker. The man hadn't simply collapsed from exhaustion or hunger. This was a person who had reached the edge, teetering on the brink of giving up entirely. The sound of approaching sirens snapped Keanu out of his thoughts. He stayed by the man's side until the ambulance arrived, refusing to leave him alone, even as the paramedics rushed in with their equipment. One of them, a woman with a calm but focused expression, knelt beside Keanu and quickly assessed the man's condition. "What happened?" she asked, her hands moving with practiced precision as she checked the man's vitals. "I saw him collapse," Keanu replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "His breathing was shallow, and his pulse is weak. I don't know exactly what's wrong, but—" He hesitated, then handed her the notebook. "I think he might have tried to hurt himself." The paramedic's eyes darkened as she skimmed through the pages, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We'll do everything we can." Keanu stepped back as they loaded the man onto a stretcher, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. As the ambulance doors swung shut and the vehicle sped off into the night, Keanu felt a strange weight settle in his chest. Most people would have walked away at this point, considering their good deed done. But Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. Something about the man's desperation, the raw emotion in those scribbled words. It all felt personal, like a silent plea for help that had somehow found its way to him. Keanu stood there for a long moment, the city's noise fading into the background. He knew he couldn't just forget about this and move on with his life. He needed to know who this man was and why he had ended up on that cold sidewalk, alone and broken. And more than that, he needed to make sure the story didn't end there. The night air clung to Keanu as he stood motionless on the sidewalk, watching the flashing lights of the ambulance fade into the distance. The city moved on around him, indifferent to the life that had just been whisked away in the back of that vehicle. Cars honked, people laughed in the distance, and the neon signs of nearby shops flickered without concern. But Keanu couldn't shake the weight in his chest. It wasn't just the man's frail figure collapsing onto the pavement or the haunting words scrawled in that notebook. It was the overwhelming sense that this man had been invisible to the world long before he'd hit the ground. Keanu finally started walking again, but instead of heading back to his hotel, he found himself moving in the direction of the hospital the paramedics had mentioned. His mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What had driven him to the brink of collapse, both physically and emotionally? And why did Keanu feel so deeply connected to a stranger he'd only just met? When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile brightness of the emergency room was a jarring contrast to the dim streets outside. The sharp scent of disinfectant stung his nose as he approached the front desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes behind thick glasses, looked up from her computer, ready to deliver the usual rehearsed line about visiting hours or privacy restrictions. But then her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "You're Keanu Reeves, right?" she asked, her voice soft with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Keanu offered a small, polite smile, but quickly shifted the focus. "Yes, but I'm here about someone who was just brought in. A man who collapsed near East 14th Street. Her expression softened, and she glanced at her screen. After a moment, she nodded. "He's here. Came in about 20 minutes ago. No ID on him, though. Do you know him?" Keanu hesitated. How could he explain this strange, overwhelming urge to stay involved? To anyone else, it might have seemed like he was just another concerned bystander, but it felt like more than that to him. Finally, he shook his head. "No, I don't. But I found this." He pulled the battered notebook from his pocket and set it on the counter. "And I think he might have needed more than just medical help." The receptionist's eyes lingered on the notebook, a frown creasing her forehead. After a pause, she gave a nod and gestured toward a row of chairs. "Why don't you wait here? I'll see if one of the nurses can give you an update." Keanu sat down, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. The hospital was a place of contradictions, life and death, hope and despair, all existing in the same cramped hallways. He watched as people came and went, a young mother clutching her child, an elderly man wheeled in by his daughter, a couple holding hands tightly as they waited for news of a loved one. Each of them had a story, but Keanu's mind remained fixed on the man he'd found lying on the sidewalk. Finally, a nurse appeared, her expression professional but gentle. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu stood quickly. "How is he?" "He's stable," she said, offering a reassuring smile. "Severely dehydrated and malnourished, but he's responding to treatment. It's a good sign." Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Stable wasn't the same as okay. "Can I see him?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. The nurse hesitated for a moment, likely weighing hospital policy against the unusual circumstances. Finally, she nodded. "Just for a few minutes, but he's still very weak." She led Keanu down a maze of hallways, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. The room they stopped at was small and dimly lit, the steady beeping of a heart monitor the only sound. The man lay on the hospital bed, looking even more fragile under the harsh lights. His skin was pale, stretched thin over sharp cheekbones, and his arms were littered with faint bruises, signs of a life spent on the margins. Keanu stepped inside, the door clicking softly behind him. For a moment, He just stood there, unsure of what to say or do. He wasn't a doctor or a therapist. He was just a guy who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. Or maybe the wrong place, depending on how you looked at it. The man stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering before they slowly opened. His eyes, a dull shade of brown, were glassy with confusion and exhaustion. For a moment, they flickered with fear, as if unsure of where he was or why a stranger was standing at his bedside. But then recognition sparked, faint but undeniable. "You're." His voice was little more than a croak, his throat dry from dehydration and disuse. "You're Keanu Reeves." Keanu gave a small, gentle nod, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "Yeah, that's me. But don't worry about that right now. You gave us all a scare out there." The man's lips trembled, his eyes welling with tears that he was too weak to wipe away. "Why? Why are you here?" Keanu shrugged, his voice soft but firm. "Because you needed help." The man's breath hitched, a soft, broken sound that tugged at Keanu's heart. I don't deserve it." Keanu shook his head, leaning forward slightly. "Everyone deserves help, no matter what." For a long moment, the man just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe those words. And then, slowly, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something that had been missing for a long time. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just the faint recognition that someone cared. Keanu sat with him in silence, the beeping of the monitors filling the gaps between their words. He didn't need to say anything more right now. Sometimes, just being there was enough. And as the man drifted back into a restless sleep, Keanu made a quiet promise to himself. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. Keanu had always believed that life had a strange way of weaving people together at just the right moments. Still, he hadn't expected that his path would cross with someone like Daniel, a man on the brink, teetering between life and death, invisible to the bustling world around him. Yet here Keanu was, sitting in a sterile hospital waiting room, feeling an overwhelming pull to this stranger whose life had unraveled in ways he could only begin to imagine. It had been 2 days since the collapse. Keanu had visited the hospital every day, waiting patiently for any updates. The nurses now greeted him with polite nods, familiar with his presence, but still curious about his connection to the patient. To them, he was just another compassionate soul, albeit one with a recognizable face, who couldn't walk away from someone in need. But Keanu knew it went deeper than that. He saw pieces of himself in Daniel, the weight of loss, the struggle to find meaning when everything seemed to fall apart. On the 3rd day, Keanu arrived early, just as the sun was rising, casting a soft, golden hue over the city. The hospital was quieter in the mornings, the chaos of the night shift fading into the calm routine of a new day. He approached the front desk, and the receptionist, now familiar with his routine, simply smiled and nodded. "He's awake today," she said, her voice warm. "Room 214. Keanu's heart quickened. He made his way down the familiar hallway, each step echoing softly against the linoleum floor. When he reached the room, he paused for a moment at the door, taking a deep breath before gently knocking and pushing it open. Daniel was sitting up slightly, propped against a few pillows. His face was still pale, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and lingering exhaustion. But there was a spark of awareness in his eyes, a subtle shift from the lifeless gaze Keanu had seen before. The room was filled with the soft hum of medical machines, their rhythmic beeping the only sound until Daniel finally spoke. "You're back," Daniel murmured, his voice hoarse but laced with a mix of surprise and disbelief. Keanu smiled, pulling the chair closer to the bed. "Of course I'm back. How are you feeling?" Daniel let out a dry, humorless chuckle that quickly turned into a weak cough. "Like I've been hit by a truck and dragged for a few miles." Keanu chuckled softly, relieved to hear even a hint of humor. "Sounds about right. But you're still here. That's what matters." Daniel's smile faded, his eyes drifting to the small window where the morning light streamed in. "I don't know why I'm still here," he whispered. I didn't think anyone would care." Keanu's heart tightened at those words. He had felt that way once, long ago, after losing people he loved. The emptiness, the sense of being lost in a world that kept moving without you. It was a feeling he knew all too well. "Well, I care," Keanu said quietly. "And I'm pretty sure there are more people who would too, if they knew what was going on." Daniel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. He turned his gaze back to Keanu, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all he found was genuine concern, something he hadn't encountered in a long time. "I don't even know your name," Keanu continued gently, hoping to ease the tension. A long pause followed before Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel. Daniel Brooks." Keanu nodded. "It's nice to meet you, Daniel." Daniel let out a shaky breath, his fingers nervously picking at the edge of the blanket. "I used to be someone," he muttered, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Had a job, a family, friends. But life, it has a way of kicking you when you're down." Keanu leaned back in his chair, giving Daniel space to share what he could. He didn't want to push, he just wanted Daniel to know he wasn't alone. "I was a writer," Daniel continued after a moment, his eyes distant as if looking back into a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "Not famous or anything, but I loved it. Words were everything to me. They helped me make sense of the world." Keanu listened intently, nodding slowly. "I had a wife," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "Emily. She was everything. The light in my life. We were married for 10 years. Then, she was gone. Car accident. Just like that." His hands trembled as he spoke, the weight of his memories pressing down on him. Keanu's chest tightened. He knew that kind of loss, the kind that leaves a hole so deep it feels like you'll never crawl out of it. "I couldn't handle it," Daniel continued, his eyes glistening. "Started drinking. Lost my job. Friends stopped calling. Eventually, I lost my apartment. One day I woke up, and I realized I had nothing left. No one left." He let out a hollow laugh, wiping a tear from his cheek. "And when you've got nothing left, you start to wonder if it's even worth sticking around." Keanu swallowed hard, his heart aching for Daniel. But he also saw something in him, a flicker of the person he used to be, buried beneath the pain and regret. "You're wrong about one thing," Keanu said gently. "You do have something left. You have you. And that's enough to start over." Daniel shook his head, his expression filled with doubt. "I don't even know where to begin." Keanu smiled softly, one step at a time. The room fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. For the first time in a long while, Daniel didn't feel invisible. And Keanu knew this was just the beginning of something more, something that neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. The days that followed became a routine neither Keanu nor Daniel had expected. Each morning, Keanu found himself returning to the sterile, overly bright hospital room, bringing small things to make Daniel's environment feel a little less clinical: a cup of decent coffee, a book or two, even a small plant he'd picked up from a shop down the street. Daniel always greeted him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as though he couldn't quite wrap his mind around why a man like Keanu Reeves would take time out of his life for someone like him. But Keanu wasn't there because of fame or obligation. He was there because, deep down, he understood what it felt like to lose everything. One afternoon, as the light filtered through the slatted blinds, Keanu arrived to find Daniel staring out the window, his thin fingers absently tracing patterns on the blanket. He looked better than he had days ago, though his body still bore the marks of neglect. Sunken cheeks, dark circles under his eyes, and a frailty that spoke of months, maybe years, of struggling alone. "You're early today," Daniel murmured without turning around, his voice still rough but stronger than before. Keanu set a coffee on the bedside table and pulled up his usual chair, Figured you might want some company before the nurses come in and poke you with more needles. Daniel chuckled weakly, finally glancing over his shoulder. You're not wrong. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint hum of machines and the occasional distant chatter of hospital staff. Keanu didn't feel the need to fill every quiet moment with words. Sometimes, just being there was enough. Eventually, Daniel sighed, his gaze dropping to his hands. I've been thinking, he said quietly, as if admitting a secret, about everything that led me here. Keanu nodded, leaning forward slightly. Want to talk about it? Daniel was silent for a long time before finally speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. After Emily died, I felt like the world just stopped, like someone hit pause on my life, but everything else kept moving. Friends tried to help at first, but I wasn't exactly good company. I pushed people away, convinced myself I didn't need anyone. He shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. Turns out, you can only isolate yourself for so long before people stop trying. Keanu listened intently, his heart heavy with understanding. He knew that feeling, the isolation, the self-imposed exile, when grief becomes too much to bear. I started drinking, Daniel continued, his eyes distant. At first, it was just to take the edge off, help me sleep. But it didn't take long before it was the only thing I cared about. I lost my job because I couldn't meet deadlines, couldn't focus on anything except the next drink. Bills piled up, and eventually, I was evicted. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You'd be surprised how quickly life can fall apart when you stop caring. Keanu's voice was gentle when he finally spoke. It's not about how fast things fall apart. It's about how you put them back together. Daniel scoffed, his eyes glistening. Put them back together. I don't even know where to start. I don't have a job, a home. Hell, I don't even have a toothbrush. Keanu smiled softly, undeterred. Then we start with the basics. Toothbrush first, then we take it from there. Daniel stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and something else flickering in his eyes, something fragile and unfamiliar. Hope. Why are you doing this? Daniel asked quietly, his voice tinged with both curiosity and suspicion. You don't even know me. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I don't need to know you to care. Everyone deserves a second chance. Besides, he paused, his gaze softening. I've been where you are. Maybe not in the exact same way, but I've lost people. I felt that emptiness, that sense that nothing will ever be okay again. Daniel was quiet for a long time, processing Keanu's words. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I'm strong enough. Keanu's response was firm but kind. You don't have to be strong all at once. Just strong enough to take the next step. That evening marked a turning point. The next day, Keanu showed up with a small bag filled with essentials, clean clothes, toiletries, and a few snacks that didn't come from a vending machine. Daniel was hesitant at first, his pride battling against his gratitude, but Keanu's unwavering support slowly chipped away at his defenses. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel began to improve. Physically, his strength was returning, his cheeks filling out slightly, and his skin regaining some of its color. But the more profound change was happening inside. With Keanu's encouragement, Daniel started to open up about his past, not just the pain and loss, but the parts of himself he buried along the way. One day, Keanu brought in a worn leather-bound notebook and placed it on Daniel's bedside table. What's this? Daniel asked, eyeing it suspiciously. A fresh start, Keanu replied with a smile. I figured you might want to write again. Daniel stared at the notebook for a long time, his fingers hovering over the cover. Writing had once been his lifeline, his way of making sense of the world. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost that part of himself. Now, with Keanu's quiet support, he felt the faintest flicker of that old passion returning. I don't know if I can, Daniel admitted, his voice tinged with fear and uncertainty. Keanu's smile never wavered. Just start with one word. That's all it takes. That night, long after Keanu had left, Daniel opened the notebook. His hands trembled slightly as he held the pen, staring at the blank page. For a moment, the fear of failure threatened to overwhelm him. But then he thought of Keanu's words, the unwavering belief in his eyes, and he let out a slow, steady breath. And then, with a shaky hand, he began to write. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good. But it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you need. As the words flowed, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose, however small. The darkness that had consumed him for so long began to recede, just a little, replaced by the faintest glimmer of light. And in that hospital room, with the soft hum of machines and the faint glow of the bedside lamp, Daniel took the first step toward reclaiming his life. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to remind you that you're worth saving. The weeks passed, and as Daniel's body healed, so too did the fragile parts of his spirit that had been buried under years of grief and despair. His face began to lose the gaunt, hollow look it had worn when Keanu first found him on that cold New York sidewalk. Color crept back into his cheeks, and though his eyes still held the shadow of his past, they also began to flicker with something new, hope. For Keanu, watching this transformation unfold was like witnessing a flower bloom in slow motion, a painful yet beautiful process that proved just how resilient the human spirit could be. Keanu remained a constant presence at the hospital, visiting Daniel every day without fail. It wasn't out of obligation or guilt. It was something deeper, something personal. Keanu had experienced his fair share of loss and hardship. He knew what it was like to wake up in the morning and feel like the world was moving without you, like the weight of grief was too heavy to carry alone. But he also knew what it meant to have someone, anyone, reach out a hand when you were at your lowest. One afternoon, as autumn deepened and the city outside began to prepare for the chill of winter, Keanu arrived at the hospital carrying something different. It wasn't coffee or a book this time, but a manila envelope, slightly worn from handling. He found Daniel sitting up in bed, the notebook Keanu had given him resting on his lap, its pages now filled with scribbles, notes, and paragraphs that marked his slow return to the craft he once loved. "You're looking better," Keanu greeted him with a smile, pulling up his usual chair. Daniel chuckled, though his voice still held a rasp. "That's what they keep telling me. I still feel like I've been hit by a truck." Keanu grinned. "But now you look like you could outrun one." Daniel shook his head, amused, before his eyes drifted to the envelope in Keanu's hands. "What's that?" Keanu leaned forward, placing the envelope on Daniel's bedside table. "I made some calls." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "Calls?" Keanu nodded. "You're a writer, Daniel. You said it yourself. And I think it's time you started seeing yourself that way again." Daniel stared at him, then at the envelope, a mix of curiosity and disbelief washing over his face. "Keanu, I haven't written anything worth reading in years. I don't even know if I can finish a full story, let alone." "Open it," Keanu interrupted gently. With trembling hands, Daniel reached for the envelope and slid out the papers inside. His eyes scanned the first page, widening as he realized what he was looking at. It was a letter from a small but respected literary magazine, expressing interest in a short story Daniel had written years ago. One he'd submitted on a whim, long before his life had spiraled out of control. They'd wanted to publish it, but Daniel had never responded. The letter had been lost, buried under piles of unpaid bills and empty bottles. I don't understand," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you?" "I did a little digging," Keanu said with a shrug, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "Found out they were still interested. I sent them a few pages from your notebook." Daniel's head shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You what?" Keanu chuckled at his reaction. "Relax. I only sent the parts you'd already shown me. And guess what? They loved it. They want more." For a long moment, Daniel just stared at him, the weight of Keanu's words sinking in. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear, excitement, and disbelief swirling inside him. This wasn't just about writing a story. It was about reclaiming a part of himself he thought had been lost forever. "I don't know if I can do this," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "What if I fail? What if I'm not the same writer I used to be?" Keanu's smile softened, and he leaned in, his voice steady and reassuring. "Then you fail. But at least you'll know you tried. And I think you'll surprise yourself, Daniel. You've got something to say. The world needs to hear it." Daniel's eyes welled with tears, and for the first time in years, he let them fall freely. It wasn't just about the story or the magazine. It was about the fact that someone believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. Keanu gave him a moment before continuing. "There's one more thing." Daniel wiped his eyes, sniffling as he tried to compose himself. "What now?" "You booked me a book tour." Keanu laughed. "Not quite. But I did find you a place to stay once you're out of here. It's nothing fancy, just a small apartment I rented for a few months. Gives you time to get back on your feet." Daniel stared at him, completely overwhelmed. I can't accept that, Keanu. You've already done so much." Keanu held up a hand, stopping him. "It's not charity, Daniel. Think of it as an investment in your future. You don't have to do this alone." Daniel's throat tightened, his heart swelling with gratitude and something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real, tangible hope that maybe, just maybe, he could build a life worth living again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Daniel looked at Keanu with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Keanu smiled, his eyes warm and kind. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel. Just promise me one thing." Daniel nodded, eager to hear whatever Keanu had to say. "Promise me you'll keep writing," Keanu said softly. "No matter what." Daniel's heart swelled, and he nodded, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I promise." And in that small hospital room, under the soft hum of machines and the quiet rustle of turning pages, a new chapter in Daniel's life began. It wasn't just about the stories he would write. It was about the story he was living. A story of resilience, of second chances, and of the unexpected kindness that could change everything. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to remind you that you're worth saving. And for Daniel, that person was Keanu Reeves. The days after Daniel left the hospital felt surreal, like waking up from a long, restless sleep to find the world still spinning, still waiting for him. Keanu had arranged for a modest apartment on the quieter side of Brooklyn. Nothing extravagant, just a small one-bedroom with creaky floors, a second-hand couch, and a view of the street where kids played stickball in the afternoons. But to Daniel, it felt like a palace. After months of drifting from shelter to shelter, or worse, sleeping under the open sky with only a thin blanket between him and the cold, having a space of his own felt like reclaiming a piece of his identity. Keanu had made sure Daniel had everything he needed: a stocked fridge, clean clothes, and even a battered old typewriter that he'd found in a thrift shop, knowing Daniel's fondness for tactile things over technology. Daniel laughed when he saw it, shaking his head at Keanu's thoughtfulness. "You really think I'm going to write the next great American novel on that?" he joked, tapping the keys and wincing at the loud clack each letter made. Keanu chuckled, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Hey," Hemingway managed, "I figured you'd appreciate the challenge." But despite the humor, there was an unspoken understanding between them. This wasn't just about writing stories. It was about writing his story, finding his voice again in the aftermath of so much silence. The first few days in the apartment were a mixture of relief and anxiety for Daniel. The quiet was both comforting and unsettling. After living in the constant noise of the streets and the sterile bustle of the hospital, silence felt like a void he wasn't sure how to fill. He found himself pacing the small living room, staring at the blank pages in his notebook, and wondering if Keanu's faith in him was misplaced. But Keanu, true to form, didn't let Daniel sink into self-doubt. He visited regularly, sometimes bringing takeout from their favorite diner, or just dropping by to check in. They'd sit for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Movies, life, books, the absurdities of the world. Keanu never pushed Daniel to write, but his presence was a reminder that someone believed in him, and that belief began to chip away at the walls Daniel had built around himself. One evening, after a particularly long day where Daniel had stared at a blank page until his eyes hurt, he found Keanu sitting on the apartment's tiny balcony, sipping a beer and watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. Daniel joined him, feeling the cool breeze against his skin, and for a while, they sat in comfortable silence. "You ever get scared?" Daniel asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "All the time." Daniel frowned, surprised by the honesty. "But you're you. You've been through so much, and you're still standing. I don't get how you do it." Keanu took a slow sip of his beer, considering his words. "It's not about not being scared," he said finally. "It's about moving forward anyway. Fear's just part of the journey. But letting it stop you, that's when you lose." Daniel absorbed that, his gaze drifting back to the city. "I'm scared I'll fail, that I'll start writing and realize I've lost whatever spark I had. What if I'm not good enough anymore?" Keanu turned to him, his voice steady and kind. "Then you fail. But at least you tried. And you'll keep trying until you don't fail anymore. It's not about being perfect, it's about showing up. Every day." Daniel let out a shaky breath, the weight of those words sinking in. Maybe he didn't have to be perfect. Maybe he just had to start. That night, after Keanu left, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the typewriter. The blank page seemed less intimidating now, less like a wall and more like a doorway. He placed his fingers on the keys, the metal cool beneath his skin, and began to type. The first words were clumsy, awkward, and didn't flow the way they used to. But he kept going. The sound of the keys clacking filled the room, a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Hours passed unnoticed, the night stretching on as Daniel poured his thoughts onto the page. He wrote about Emily, about the crushing weight of grief and the numbness that followed. He wrote about the streets, the shelters, the cold nights where he wondered if he'd ever see the sun again. And then he wrote about Keanu, about the unexpected kindness of a stranger who refused to let him disappear. When he finally stopped, his fingers ached and tears blurred his vision. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just about the words. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that he thought was lost forever. The next day, Keanu stopped by, as he always did, and found Daniel at the kitchen table, his notebook open, and pages scattered around him. "You've been busy," Keanu observed with a smile, picking up a sheet of paper and scanning the words. Daniel watched him nervously, waiting for some sign of approval or critique. But Keanu just nodded, his smile widening. "This is good, Daniel. Really good." Daniel felt a warmth spread through his chest, a mix of pride and disbelief. "You really think so?" Keanu met his gaze, his expression serious. "I know so." Over the next few weeks, Daniel's confidence grew. He wrote every day, sometimes for hours, losing himself in the stories that had been bottled up inside him for so long. Keanu continued to be his anchor, reading drafts, offering feedback, and most importantly, reminding Daniel of his worth whenever self-doubt crept back in. One evening, as they sat in the apartment with takeout boxes scattered around them, Keanu pulled out his phone and showed Daniel an email. "I sent your latest piece to that magazine," Keanu said casually. "They want to publish it." Daniel's eyes widened, his heart pounding in his chest. "You what?" Keanu laughed at his reaction. "Come on, you knew it was good." "They loved it, Daniel. And they're not the only ones. I've got a feeling people are going to connect with your story." Daniel was speechless, the weight of Keanu's words sinking in. For so long, he believed his story didn't matter, that his voice had been silenced by his failures. But here he was, holding proof that his words could still make a difference, not just for himself, but for others. As the reality of it all settled in, Daniel looked at Keanu, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu's smile was soft, his eyes warm. "You already have." And in that small apartment, surrounded by crumpled pages and the remnants of takeout dinners, Daniel realized that his story wasn't just about loss and failure. It was about resilience, about finding hope in the most unexpected places, and about the power of kindness to change a life. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to remind you that you're worth saving. And for Daniel, that person had been Keanu Reeves. A year had passed since that cold autumn night when Keanu Reeves found Daniel collapsed on the sidewalk, and in that time, Daniel's life had undergone a transformation so profound it felt like he was living someone else's story. But it was his. Every messy, painful, beautiful part of it. The scars of his past were still there, etched into his heart and mind, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of how far he'd come and how a single act of kindness had pulled him back from the edge. The modest apartment in Brooklyn had become a sanctuary, a space where Daniel not only healed but thrived. The once blank pages of his notebook were now filled with stories, some fictional, others drawn from the depths of his own experiences. His fingers, once hesitant and unsure on the typewriter keys, now danced with confidence, spilling out words that resonated with readers in ways he never imagined possible. His first published piece, an essay about his struggle with grief and homelessness, had struck a chord with thousands of readers. It wasn't just the raw honesty of his words that captivated people. It was the vulnerability, the acknowledgement of pain, and the undeniable thread of hope woven through his narrative. Letters and emails poured in from strangers around the world, sharing their own stories of loss and survival, and thanking him for giving voice to feelings they hadn't known how to express. But the most significant milestone came when Daniel's memoir, "The Stranger Who Saved Me," was released. It wasn't just a book. It was a testament to resilience, a tribute to the power of compassion, and an exploration of how even the smallest act of kindness could alter the course of a life. The memoir quickly climbed the bestseller lists, resonating not just with those who had faced similar struggles, but with anyone who had ever felt lost, broken, or alone. The day of his first major book signing event arrived with a mix of excitement and nerves. The venue was a cozy independent bookstore nestled in the heart of Manhattan, its shelves lined with the scent of old paper and fresh ink. A line of people stretched out the door, each clutching the copy of Daniel's memoir, their faces eager and expectant. Daniel stood behind a small table near the front, a stack of books beside him and a pen in hand. His heart pounded in his chest as the first person approached, a young woman with tear-filled eyes and trembling hands. "Your book," she began, her voice breaking. "It saved my life. I was in such a dark place, and reading your story, it gave me hope." Daniel's throat tightened, and for a moment, he struggled to find words. He reached across the table, gently clasping her hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." Person after person stepped forward, each sharing pieces of their own stories. Battles with depression, the weight of loss, the struggle to find purpose. Daniel listened to every word, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had once believed his story didn't matter, that his voice had been drowned out by failure and despair. But here, in this room filled with people who saw themselves in his journey, he realized just how powerful storytelling could be. Near the back of the room, leaning casually against a bookshelf, Keanu watched it all unfold. He hadn't come for recognition or praise. He simply wanted to see Daniel shine in a way he always knew he could. But as he observed the long line of people waiting to meet the man whose words had touched their hearts, Even Keanu felt the enormity of what had happened. He hadn't just saved a life that night on the sidewalk. He'd ignited a spark that now lit up the lives of countless others. When the event finally wound down, and the last book was signed, Daniel looked up and saw Keanu waiting patiently. His face broke into a wide, genuine smile as he stood, weaving through the now empty rows of chairs to meet him. "Took you long enough to come over," Daniel teased, though his voice was thick with emotion. Keanu grinned, pulling Daniel into a firm hug. "I figured you were busy being a literary rock star." Daniel chuckled, pulling back to meet Keanu's eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you." Keanu shook his head, his gaze steady and sincere. "You did this, Daniel. I just reminded you of what you were capable of." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of the event, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice softer but filled with conviction. "You saved my life, Keanu. I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for that." Keanu's smile was gentle, his eyes reflecting the warmth of a man who had long understood the value of kindness. "You already have, Daniel. Every word you've written, every life you've touched. That's more than enough." As they stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights twinkling around them, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still days when the shadows of his past threatened to creep back in. But now he knew he wasn't alone. He had found his voice, his purpose, and most importantly, he had rediscovered his worth. The world moved on around them, as it always did, but for Daniel, everything had changed. His story wasn't just one of survival, it was a testament to the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the incredible impact one person's kindness could have on another's life. And as he walked beside Keanu, the man who had refused to let him fade into the background, Daniel realized that sometimes the greatest stories aren't the ones we write on paper. They're the ones we live, shaped by the people who believe in us when we've forgotten how to believe in ourselves.